going to cover 3 chapters in 1 Samuel, chapters 13, 14, and 15. And we're going to look at the major decisions that Saul made that sabotaged his ability to lead God's people as king. There's a lot to cover here. I'm going to try to do it in under 30 minutes in this video. But what I want you to do is take the principles that we talk about today, and I want you to do some further study with them on your own. Now, in these 3 chapters, there's a whole lot to talk about that we're not going to talk about, because what I want to do is just look at it from a leadership standpoint. What are the leadership decisions Saul made that really hurt him and really enabled him to give up the throne because he could not lead God's people? So let's begin in chapter 13 in the way of context. Saul was 30 years old when he became king and reigned for 42 years. Saul selected 3,000 special troops from the army of Israel and sent the rest of the men home. He took 2,000 of the chosen men with him to Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. The other 1,000 went with Saul's son Jonathan to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. Soon after this, Jonathan attacked and defeated the garrison of Philistines at Geba. The news spread quickly among the Philistines, so Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, "Hebrews, hear this, rise up and revolt." All Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba, and that the Philistines now hated the Israelites more than ever. So the entire Israelite army was summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Now, I want to go down now and read verse 19. There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. The Philistines wouldn't allow them for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So whenever the Israelites needed to sharpen their plowshares, picks, axes, or sickles, they had to take them to a Philistine blacksmith. And then down in verse 22, so on the day of the battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except for Saul and Jonathan. So here's the context. 350 years since Joshua entered the land of Israel. It is still controlled by the Philistines, and Israel is still living as slaves in the land. And why I say that is, they didn't have any weapons. They had to go to the Philistines to get their plowshares sharpened because they wouldn't allow it. Saul yells, "Let's rise up and revolt." Well, you don't revolt against someone who you're not under. And so the Philistines clearly still ran Israel, and Israel, after 350 years, still had not taken the land. And so Saul is leading a revolt. Jonathan, who we often think of as David's friend, was also a mighty, mighty warrior and really gave them the first victory against the Philistines that gave Saul kind of the confidence then to rise up and revolt. Okay, so that's the context here that begins a series of decisions that Saul makes that really, really hurts him. Verse 5, the Philistines mustered a mighty army of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and as many warriors as the grains of sand on the seashore. So the writer here is painting this picture of, okay, there's 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and when you looked out there, it was like sand on the seashore. There were so many men you couldn't count them. And I like the way he paints that picture. So you have 3,000 men now, 3,000 men in Israel against thousands and thousands. There's more chariots than there are men for Israel in the Philistine army. And so when the men of Israel saw the tight spot they were in, and because they were hard pressed by the enemy, they tried to hide in caves, thickets, rocks, holes, and cisterns. Some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. So the men are so scared that they start hiding. They start jumping down in cisterns, which is a deep well that holds water. They're hiding in caves. They just start scattering, and in fact, they start scattering to the point that in 14:2 you'll find out that Saul ends up with only 600 men left after this whole thing. Saul loses 2,400 men who get so scared they just run off. So meanwhile, and I'm going to go ahead and read through 14 now, and then I'll come back and tell you a little bit about Saul's decisions. Meanwhile, Saul stayed at Gilgal, and his men were trembling with fear. Saul waited there 7 days for Samuel, but as Samuel had instructed him earlier, but Samuel still didn't come. Saul realized that his troops were rapidly slipping away, so he demanded, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings," and Saul sacrificed the burnt offering himself. Just as Saul was finishing with the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to meet him and welcome him, but Samuel says, "What have you done?" Saul replied, "I saw my men scattering from me, and you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I still haven't asked for the Lord's help. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering myself before you came. How foolish, Samuel exclaimed. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. So, the first big mistake Saul makes is disobedience. That was his first action. That was his first decision he makes, is disobedience. And the disobedience is simply this. In the law given by God, only a priest could sacrifice the offering to God. Samuel is the priest who's going to come and offer that burnt offering. Samuel says, wait for me for 7 days. I will be there, and then once we have the burnt offering, you will have the blessing of the Lord to go in and fight the Philistines. Saul is watching all of his men leave. He's watching the Philistine army come nearer and nearer, and finally, he decides that Samuel is not coming, and so he goes and he makes the burnt offering himself. And when he makes the burnt offering himself, he violates the law of God and is walking in disobedience before God. And Samuel says, because you're not willing to do that, because you're disobeying God, God's going to take the kingdom away from you and give it to someone else. In other words, not in your lifetime, but your son is not going to be the next king. Your lineage will not continue this kingship. It will be someone else's family that does. Now, if you'll remember, just a few chapters ago, Saul had been put to the test about waiting for Samuel for 7 days, and he had passed that test. But now that the pressure's on, Samuel doesn't arrive when Saul wants him to, and so Saul doesn't pass this test and ends up failing miserably. And what I want you to look at here is the reasons he walked in disobedience, because the reasons are as enlightening as the disobedience itself. And the number one motive, I think, underneath the disobedience is fear. It's fear. The army was huge. The army was coming against them. Saul is losing his men. Out of 3,000 men, 2,400 of his men run away. And he is absolutely terrified. In fact, right there in verse 7, I think it is, Saul and his men were trembling with fear. They thought they were going to die that day. And because of fear, he makes a bad decision. Now, second is impatience. Okay? He had already learned patience in that previous test when he waited on Samuel, and Samuel showed up after 7 days. But now when the pressure's on and there's fear going on, boy, that impatience becomes a lot bigger issue, and he's not willing to wait. And so at the last moment, right before Samuel shows up, he loses his patience. He is impatient, and in his impatience, he sins. What's interesting is when Samuel comes now and confronts Saul, Saul is not willing to take on his action, but blames Samuel for it. And one of the reasons God can't use Saul and calls David, not because David was such an awesome, righteous man, and we know that from further stories later on down the line, but David always had the capacity to repent, to say he was sorry, to come back to God, to confess his sin. And that's what God was looking for in his leader. He wanted a man with a soft heart. Well, Saul didn't have a soft heart. He had a hard heart. So he's not willing to say, you know what, I messed up. I'm so sorry. I should not have done that. I repent. Please forgive me. No, he's saying, well, Samuel, it's your fault. If you'd have shown up earlier, we wouldn't have these problems. That's the kind of heart God can't work with. And that's what Saul had. It was that pride. It was that ego. It was that I can't wait. I'm impatient. I'm going to do this. And then when he's confronted, instead of confessing, he's blaming. And so that's that part of Saul's heart that really, really undercut his ability or sabotaged his ability to lead God's people. And then the third one here, obviously, then is peer pressure. He's got this huge peer pressure on what he's going to do. His men are leaving. I mean, 2,400 of his men run off, and there's this huge pressure. I've got to make a decision before I lose everyone. I've got to make a decision because don't you know his leaders are saying to him, Saul, you got to make a decision. Saul, you're losing all your men. Saul, you got to do this. I'm sure the peer pressure was immense for Saul to come up and to make a decision. And so finally Saul makes a decision. It's just the wrong decision. And so that is what is going on. That's the motives behind his disobedience. Now, I want to stop here for a minute, and I want to talk to you about application, because I think this is so applicable to all of us today. Whether you are a man or a woman, whether you are 80 or 20, this applies to you. And that is, most of the time in our disobedience, you can look underneath the surface to our motives and you can see a cocktail of these three events going on in our life. First is fear. Second is impatience. And third is peer pressure. Now, when it comes to fear, every person has fear. Every person has fear. So one of the things I want you to hear is this. Just because you have fear doesn't mean that you're not a good leader or you don't have faith, okay? Because when we're going through tough times in life, when we have a hard decision to make at the office, when we have a tough decision to make with our kids, we can get anxious, we can get insecure, we can wonder if this is the right thing to do, we can get scared of the consequences. There's nothing unfaithful about having fear, because that's a common human emotion. The issue for leadership is, what are you going to do with the fear? What do you do? Are you going to let the fear control you, or are you going to manage the fear and still do the right thing? See, Saul, of course, is going to be scared when a Philistine army is huge. What should he have done? He should have said, guys, I'm scared too. We're all scared, but Samuel's coming. We're going to wait on him. We're going to wait on God, and then God's going to give us the blessing, and we're going to move in. Did you notice what Saul never did? He never summoned the troops. He never gave the inspirational speech. Remember last video we talked about great leaders have an inspirational speech? He didn't give an inspirational speech. And the most obvious thing he didn't do was what so many biblical leaders do in the Old Testament, and that is, he didn't say, God is on our side, God will come and help us, let's just wait on God. Of course we're scared, of course we're fearful, but we're going to wait on the Lord our God, and he's going to come and bring us victory today. There was none of that in Saul, and that's why Saul couldn't lead his people, is because he couldn't manage his fear. So what you have to do as a leader is you have to manage your fear. You accept it, you may even talk about it, but you don't let it manage you. You don't let it begin to tell you how you're going to run your life. And so you have to manage that fear. You have to put that fear under your faith. You have to depend on God. You have to rely on God so that the fear doesn't dictate the actions. Look at the big decisions in your life that you regret. I bet most of them were motivated by fear. Now, part of that cocktail too then is what fear leads to, and fear leads to impatience. When we're fearful, we're antsy. See, when I don't have fear, or when I've managed my fear, when I'm living by faith, I can wait on God's timing. And God, you know as well as I do, never shows up too early. He's always right on time. He's never late. He's always right on time, but he does not show up early. And usually he's waiting for us to get to the end of ourselves and get to the end of our flesh and get to the end of our human abilities, so that when he shows up, we know that it's him and we give him the glory. And so part of the reason God may not be showing up in your life quickly is because you keep fighting in your own flesh, and he's waiting for you to die to all that before he shows up. And so here's Saul, and part of that fear leads to his impatience, and the impatience is what leads to the sin. And so that's what happens with us. We have this cocktail of fear, and instead of managing the fear, instead of having faith, instead of going to God, instead of submitting to him, instead of seeking his will, instead of praying to him, what do? We get impatient, and when we get impatient, we act, and we act too quickly. And acting too quickly is usually in the flesh, and acting too quickly in the flesh leaves out the Spirit of God. And you wonder why you don't see the miraculous hand of God working in your life very often. Well, it may be because you have this cocktail of fear and impatience working together, and you're always acting before God is ready for you to act. And so because you do that, then you kind of sabotage your ability to wait on God for him to come and rescue you. And so, and it happens over and over and over and over again in Scripture, and you can certainly see it here. And then the third part of that is peer pressure. We always have the peer pressure of the world saying, well, do it the world's way. Make decisions the world's way. Come and operate like the world. And so we have this peer pressure to operate like the world, which is flesh, which is fear. We have our own fears that we have to overcome and submit to the Spirit of God. And then we have this impatient part of us that just wants to do something, because even if we do the wrong thing, it's better than doing nothing. And boy, that cocktail right there leads us into disobedience so many times. So look at the major decisions you make that hurt you. Look at the way you make decisions in your life. Look at the way you lead people. And look at that cocktail of fear, accompanied with peer pressure, accompanied with impatience, and you take those three together, and it will lead you to disobedience every single time. So just think about that for your own life. Okay, so that's the first really, really big way in which Saul sabotaged his ability to lead God's people. Now let's look at the next one, and this is going to be in chapter 14. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to read all of chapter 14. It's very long. I'm going to tell some of the story, but I will read a little bit of it. One day Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped on the outskirts of Gibeah around the pomegranate tree. Now look down to verse 3. No one realized that Jonathan had left Israel like camp. To reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between two rocky cliffs. Now look, verse 6. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle, whether he has many warriors or only a few. So now I want you to think about this. Jonathan sneaks away from the camp. Saul doesn't know he's gone, and Jonathan doesn't know what Saul's up to while he's gone. He's got his armor bearer, and he has faith. He has the one thing Saul didn't have. And he tells his armor bearer, look, this is not about us versus the Philistines. This is about God versus the Philistines, and we're on God's side, and God is our leader. And God doesn't need 6,000, 60,000, or even 600 troops. He just needs the two of us. And God can win this battle. So we're going to live by faith, and we're going to win this battle for God. And so he goes on and says, verse 7, the armor bearer says, do what you think is best. I'm completely with you, whatever you decide. All right, then, Jonathan told him, we will cross over and let them see us. Now, here's his plan. Let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are, you're killed, or we'll kill you, then we'll stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we'll go up. That will be the Lord's sign that will help us to defeat. So what he's saying is we're just going to kind of show ourselves to them. And then they're either going to yell, come down here and fight, or we're going to go kill you. And if they say, come on down here and fight, that's our sign that God's going to give us the victory. Well, they flash themselves. The people say, come on down and fight. So Jonathan and his armor bearer come down and fight 20 Philistines and kill them. And so here's what happens next. It becomes a miracle of God. So look at verse 13. So they climbed up and used both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed those who came behind them. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about half an acre. Suddenly panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outposts and raiding armies. And just then an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. So this becomes a God event. So Jonathan is right. God doesn't need a whole lot of warriors. He just needs 2 men with faith. And the 2 men with faith come and kill 20 Philistines. The Philistines look around and think they're being attacked. All of a sudden, God sends an earthquake. Everyone begins to panic, and what happens? Well, the same thing you see all the time in the Old Testament. God intervenes, confuses the minds of the Philistines. They start killing each other, and God's giving the victory to the Israelites, and Saul and the army has done nothing. He used 2 people to defeat the Philistine army. So verse 16, Saul's lookouts in Gibeah and Benjamin saw a strange sight. The vast army of the Philistines began to melt away in every direction. Call the roll and find out who's missing, Saul ordered, and when they checked, they found that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. Now, remember that, because we're going to come back to that in just a second. Then Saul shouted to Abijah, bring the ephod here, for at that time Ahijah was wearing the ephod in front of the Israelites. But while Saul was talking to the priest, the confusion of the Philistine camp grew louder and louder. So Saul said to the priest, never mind, let's get going. So I want you to imagine this. Now, Saul's the hero. Jonathan is the hero. Saul's the king, but he hadn't done anything. He's been hiding with his men, those few men that are left. Well, now he sees the Philistines, and they are really in a mess, and it's all confusion. So now he wants to seek the Lord. But when he goes to seek the Lord, once again, circumstances make it where he doesn't have time to seek the Lord, quote. And so he says, never mind, let's just go. So for the second time, Saul shows no faith, doesn't wait on the Lord, doesn't seek the Lord's will. He just goes and says, never mind, let's just go get them. Now look at verse 24. Now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion that day because Saul had placed them under an oath, saying, Let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have full revenge on my enemies. So no one ate anything all day, even though they had all found honeycomb on the ground in the forest. They didn't dare touch the honey because they all feared the oath they had taken. So here's the second huge failing of Saul as king, and that is impulsive decisions. Impulsive decision. Think about how bad this decision is. Saul makes the decision to call a fast on a day of war. You know, if there's anything his army needs, it's sustenance and food and energy to fight the enemy. But Saul has called a fast. This oath that he's called his fast. Why? Because he doesn't want anyone to eat until what? He's taken vengeance on his enemies. Now I want you to think about the chain of events here and Saul's pride and his anger. Okay, first of all, Saul was confronted by Samuel. Hurt his pride. Then Samuel tells Saul, God's going to take the kingdom away from you. So he's panicked. He's angry. He's frustrated. So who does he want to take it out on? The Philistines, his enemy. Then his son comes and becomes the hero and basically gives them the victory that day. And so Saul now is insecure. His son's the hero. He looks like a coward. The great prophet in front of everyone has told him that God's going to take the kingdom away because he's a disobedient leader. And what is the natural response to men? What is our default emotion? Anger. You know, default emotion for a woman is sadness. The default emotion for a man is anger. So he's angry. He's angry. He wants vengeance on his enemy. He needs a victory because he needs to look good. He needs to look better than his son. He needs to prove Samuel and God wrong, that this is still his kingdom and these are still his men and he can do this and he can lead. And so he's angry and he's frustrated and he wants revenge and his pride's been hurt and his ego's been hurt and he's insecure and someone else has upstaged him. And so what does he do? He makes a stupid, impulsive decision to call a fast on the very day that they're going to go to war. And if you don't obey the oath, then you're killed. How many times have you seen leaders destroy themselves because in their pride, ego, and anger, they make bad decisions? They make decisions based on emotion. A great leader learns how to put his emotions aside, put his pride aside, put his personal agenda to the side, and lead by doing what is best for the people. Saul sabotaged his ability to lead because he could not do that. He let his anger and his pride and his selfishness lead to impulsive decisions that hurt his people. And because of that, we're going to see in just a minute, his people stop following him. You know, it doesn't matter what you claim you are. You can claim all day you're a leader, but if you don't have followers, you're not a leader. And Saul lost his leadership because he lost his followers. And he lost his followers because of bad decisions based on emotion. So just remember that no matter what you're leading, your family, a corporation, whatever it is, you cannot make impulsive decisions based on emotion. You have to deal with the emotion, then come back and make the decision that's best for those you are leading. Remember that when it comes to employees. Remember that when it comes to your wife and your children. That is such an important lesson about leadership. Okay, so let's move on. And the third one is, this is the third thing Saul did that absolutely sabotaged his ability to lead God's people. And it was this: inflexibility. Inflexibility. Now, let me tell you the rest of the story of chapter 14, and then we'll move on to chapter 15. Chapter 14 is this: Jonathan gets done and he eats something. He eats some honey off a honeycomb because Jonathan is gone winning the victory when Saul makes the oath. So Jonathan doesn't know about the oath. So now Saul's ready to go into battle and beat the Philistines because the Philistines are all confused and they're running, and so they want to take advantage while they're running to go kill as many Philistines as possible. So now all of a sudden Saul wants to seek out God to make sure that's God's will, and he can't, quote, get an answer from God. So he decides it's because they're sitting in the camp, somebody broke the oath. So they cast lots, and the lot falls onto Jonathan. So Jonathan is the one that broke the oath. So in Saul's mind, he's thinking Jonathan is the one that's keeping God now from blessing us. And so look what happens beginning in verse 43. Tell me what you have done, Saul demanded of Jonathan. I tasted a little honey, Jonathan admitted. It was only a little bit on the end of my stick. Does that deserve death? Yes, Jonathan, Saul said, you must die. May God strike me and even kill me if you do not die for this. But the people broke in and said to Saul, Jonathan has won this great victory for Israel. Should he die? Far from it. As surely as the Lord lives, not one hair on his head will be touched. For God helped him do a great deed today. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So I want you to hear what happens. It's the inflexibility now. Remember all of the motives behind what Saul is going through here. He's prideful, he's arrogant, he's been hurt by his son Jonathan because he's been upstaged. Jonathan's the hero. So he's going to kill his own son Jonathan. He's made an oath, and Jonathan broke the oath, so I'm just going to kill him. And the people rose up against him and said, you know, you're not. You're a bad leader. These are bad decisions. You're not going to kill Jonathan. He's the hero of the day. And so they literally rescue Jonathan from Saul and rise up against Saul and don't pay attention to Saul's leadership. Why? Inflexibility. So many times with these impulsive decisions that we make, then once we've made them, our pride kicks in and we say, it may be a bad decision, but I'm not changing it now. How many times have you done that as a father or as a mother to your kids? How many times have you done that with coworkers or employees in your job? How many times have you dug your heels in the sand with a friend or with your spouse or with your girlfriend or boyfriend, where you say, I may have made a bad decision, but I'm not changing it now? That's nothing but pride, and it leads to the fall every time. Inflexibility will destroy you. Listen, let me tell you about great leadership. Great leadership is when you are in a situation and you have made a bad decision, you simply do what David did. David was a great leader in the kingdom. You just simply say, you know what, that was a bad decision. It was the wrong decision. I'm sorry. I apologize. Now let's go fix this and let's make a good decision. See, bad decisions won't destroy you if you're willing to stop and repent and turn it around and follow it with a good decision. Bad decisions destroy you when you get prideful and refuse to change. The best thing your employees or your children or others that you're leading can hear from you is, I am sorry when you're wrong. That is great leadership. Now, we need to go, and I'm not going to get done here in 30 minutes, and I'm sorry about that. We've got to jump to 15, chapter 15, and this is the fourth and final big area in which Saul failed, and it cost him the kingdom, and that is greed. One day Samuel said to Saul, this is chapter 15, verse 1, it was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people Israel. Now listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. So the Amalekites were very wicked, evil people, and they had come against the Israelites in the desert, and God now saying, I'm going to get revenge on them for that because I need them wiped off the earth because God knew their hearts. Now this is a very controversial scripture in Old Testament that a lot of non-Christians use to say you should never follow the Christian God, and this is a big step or a big stepping stone in their lack of faith. Okay, but let me tell you about the context. First of all, Israel is God's children, and God protects his children. And the Amalekites were evil people that were not going to change, and he knew that for every little boy and every little girl that lived, that was another terrorist. That was another, quote, suicide bomber, if you will. And he knew they weren't going to change, and he knew they weren't going to repent, and they knew they weren't going to do anything except cause pain and suffering to God's people. And so God has to protect his people by getting rid of the Amalekites. It would be like someone breaking into your house to murder your children and rape your wife, and you say, you know what, in order to protect my family, what do I have to do? I have to wipe this guy out. Well, that's exactly what God is doing. He's protecting his family from a group of people that would absolutely destroy his family, and God knew that, and so God asked Saul now to wipe them out. So remember, this is God's doing, not Saul's. So Saul comes. In verse 7, Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way up to Shur. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats and cattle and fat calves and lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless and of poor quality. Now listen to what happened. Saul comes in and he destroys everybody, but he keeps Agag because remember, Saul now is very prideful. He's turned from humility a few chapters ago to very prideful, and he keeps Agag as a trophy to show everybody, see, I captured a king and I beat another army. It was God's doing, but Saul's taking all the credit, and he wants to show, he's trying to prove himself to be king, prove himself to be leader. Have you ever noticed that you never really prove anything when you try to prove yourself as a leader? Leadership comes naturally. But then his greed takes over, and they keep all the good cattle and the good sheep and the good goats. They only kill the ones that are worthless and wounded and not any good. Okay? So now, listen to Saul's attitude here. Then the Lord said to Samuel, verse 10, I'm sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and has refused to obey my commands. Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. Early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Now just stop and think about that for a minute. What's Saul doing in his victory? He's had one victory that God gave him. He didn't obey the Lord in it, and what does he want to do? He wants to set up a monument to himself. He's building a monument to himself. Pride and ego comes before the fall. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. May the Lord bless you, he said. I've carried out the Lord's command. So Saul's on this high because he finally won a victory, and so he's just giddy. Verse 14, then what is all the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear? Samuel demanded. Well, it is true that the army spared the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle, Saul admitted, but they are going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. We have destroyed everything else. Now listen to what Saul says. He's now putting a religious twist on it. Well, yeah, we saved the best, but we're going to make a sacrifice. It's kind of like saying, well, yeah, I made $100,000 illegally, but I'm going to tithe to the church, so it's okay. He's justifying his actions. And then look what he says, though. He says, sacrifice him to the Lord your God, Samuel. He didn't say my God. He didn't say our God. He said, Samuel, it's your God. That tells you something about Saul's heart here. Then Samuel said to Saul, stop, listen to what the Lord told me last night. What did he tell you? Saul asked. And Samuel said, although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? See, God and Samuel both understand that pride comes out of insecurity. Look what the Lord said, although you may think little of yourself. See, all of this vibrato and building a monument and keeping Amalekite as a trophy, that's all insecurity. He says, you're thinking little of yourself. You're not trusting in God. You're not saying, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You're operating in the flesh. You're operating in insecurity. The Lord has anointed you as king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they're all dead. Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? But I did obey the Lord, Saul insisted. I carried out the mission you gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle to plunder, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So once again, he repeats himself. It's your God, and we just did it for the sacrifice, which is clearly not true. His motive was greed. So Samuel replied, and this is what is so sad. What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering a fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as the worshiping of idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord has rejected you as king. Just a really, really sad scripture there in verse 22 and 23. Then Saul admitted to Samuel, yes, I have sinned. I have disobeyed your instructions in the Lord's command, for I was afraid of the people and did what they commanded. See, there's that fear coming in. Listen, fear is a motive for so much of our disobedience. He was afraid of the people, but now please forgive my sin and come back to me that I may worship the Lord. See, Saul is still blaming someone else. Well, it was the people's fault. The people made me do it. Saul still doesn't get it, and when you read on, you see that Saul is going to lose the kingdom, and we'll pick up with that in chapter 16 next time. Here's what I want you to hear as we close this out. Saul made 4 really, really major decisions that undermine anyone's ability to lead. Disobedience, based on this cocktail that we talked about earlier of fear and impatience and peer pressure. He made impulsive decisions. He was inflexible and he was greedy. And any of those four areas, if they creep into your life, they will undermine your ability to lead. And so what I'm asking you to do is just look at this. Just look at these areas of your life and make sure that as you're leading people, you don't let those creep in and undermine your leadership. Because these three chapters are so practical. It could literally be a bestseller on New York Times bestsellers list. So many great leadership principles, so many pitfalls to avoid in leadership. Pay attention to this and listen to this, because this is life-changing and life-altering for your ability to lead other people.